Le Castellet, France, the site of the French Grand Prix, which just happened recently, and it was a fantastic race, right up until Ferrari decided to completely melt down. Not totally out of character, but come on, Ferrari! And despite the rest of the race being a relative stinker, and despite being the Jai Courtney of racetracks, the host for this race, the Circuit Paul Ricard, has gotten more hate than it deserves in its lifetime. Yeah, it lacks elevation, and it has been an absolute logistical nightmare when getting in and out of the circuit, but it is a damn good facility when you factor in everything else. Which is why on the weekend of the Grand Prix, in the midst of a packed crowd, waving their French flags proudly on that hot summer day, the announcement was made that Paul Ricard would no longer play host to the French Grand Prix. And from everything we can gather, the French Grand Prix altogether, well, that's in turmoil, not having a place on the calendar in lieu of opening up more spots for Grand Prix that, to put it nicely, are questionable. Now, without wishing to sound like one of those traditionalist mouth breathers that believes the sport should remain untouched from the time where Formula One raced exclusively in Europe, wages were fair, and people where they drank, it seems a little wrong for the sport to abandon tracks such as Spa-Francorchamps or whole nations such as France. Granted, each have their issues. Spa is a little bit dangerous and somewhat devoid of good racing, and France is France. But pushing stereotypes aside, having a race in France seems almost vital when you've got a few French drivers on that grid, as well as a whole French team in Alpine. Seeing as how Paul Ricard has been axed, however, and that it was realistically on the chopping block for a variety of reasons, that does pose a question. How can we save it? How can we save the French Grand Prix? Again. Well, first, let's look at the tracks that France currently has, and which ones could realistically host a Grand Prix in France. And forewarning here, that's trickier than you may think, because France has a really weird problem when it comes to suitable racetracks for Formula One. But before giving you the spiel on that, I gotta talk about these guys. Ah yes, good old reliable Surfshark VPN. Now, most of you are probably aware of what a VPN is, but for those of you that aren't familiar, I'll give you some infos. So Surfshark is a VPN service that encrypts all that data that you send through the internet, thereby protecting it and keeping any lunatics from getting at it. Is that it? Yeah, I could see you want more. And guess what? Surfshark does offer more. So we all love streaming, right? And we do hate it whenever streaming services are restricted based on what country we're in, right? Well, with Surfshark, you can bypass that, changing your location and allowing you access to your favorite shows, or in certain parts of the world, your favorite YouTubers, and can be a critical tool for those who live in countries that like to heavily censor the people. It ain't quite teleportation, but it is about as close as we're gonna get right now. So here's Surfshark's offer for the month. By using my link in the description and using the promo code JoshRebel, you can get Surfshark VPN for 83% off and 3 extra months for free. That's full-on protection online for as little as a couple bucks a month. Plus, there's 3 free months on there. Oh yeah, almost forgot. You've also got a 30-day money-back guarantee as well. So thanks once again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Be sure to give them a try, because they'll be sure to steer you onto the right track. Track. Oh yeah, tracks. We were talking about French Grand Prix tracks, weren't we? F it, let's just go to the first one. There's magny-cours, the track that previously played host to the French Grand Prix. Personally, I like the track. It doesn't mean to say that the racing is, or ever was, necessarily good. However, not to mention either that it's a million miles away from anywhere and that the pit lane is too narrow. People throughout the paddock hated racing there, and going back probably isn't the best option. So now we've thrown that in the bin. What about the last track to have hosted the French Grand Prix? Well, before that, it was Paul Ricard, but before that even, it was Dijon-Premois. Racing in this circuit is objectively better, given it's not a stop-start circuit like magny-cours can be at times. After all, we had that monstrous battle between Renaud Arnoux and Gilles Villeneuve in 1979. And on top of that, it's actually close to civilization, being just outside of Dijon. The issue, however, is everything else. Compared to the nice, spick-span, up-to-date facilities that you would see at current Formula One venues, Dijon is an outhouse at a carnival. A lot of dough is going to be required to get it up to grade 1 standard, and even if it was, today's cars will almost certainly be lapping in under a minute. And I don't know if that's something we really want, isn't it? So then you'd have to consider extending the track, which might not be so difficult in terms of finding space, but then you would have to remember the redesign will almost certainly be made under the pencil of Tilke. And I don't know if we want that either. Okay, then, if not that, what other ones were there? Well, there was the CHARADE circuit in Clermont-Ferrand, but that track is currently barely suitable for unicycle racing, never mind Formula One. Great track, but if Formula One is not keen on Paul Ricard, I don't know if this is going to melt their butter either. Rouen infrastructure is gone, and it had a habit of having more deaths than actual race winners. There's also Rem, which I'm guessing I'm saying wrong, but anyway, that track does have infrastructure there, but it is 100 million years old, and that is the good stuff about it. If you want to go back to the pre-war days, there was a track on the outskirts of Paris called but you'd have an easier time curing world hunger than getting this thing up to grade 1 spec. So what? I guess that means we're screwed, right? Well, there is one more option. Combine the words Le Mans and Formula 1 and immediately you'll hear groaning from F1 aficionados. Josh, why are you suggesting Le Mans? Remember what happened last time they raced there? Well, as it so happens, yes, I do. It was really bad, but think of what you got. Think of what you got. An established facility with a whole lot of history behind it, and not at all far away from the city centre of Le Mans, which in and of itself is much closer to Paris than Dijon or magny-cours are. So then you ask, well, what circuit do they use? There is, after all, the Sarthe circuit that they use for the 24-hour of Le Mans, the car-breaking 8.5-mile ribbon of tarmac that slides through the streets and has become the hallmark for endurance racing. In an ideal world, Formula 1 would use this track. But we don't live in an ideal world. Otherwise, King Latifi would be world champion by now. The circuit would need to be upgraded to grade 1 first of all, and even if it did get it by some massive miracle, it's a complete shot in the dark as to whether the track would actually produce good racing, as the nature of the track probably wouldn't allow for it. And it would require even more personnel than usual to make the weekend work. So then, you look at the other circuit, the Bugatti circuit, the track that currently hosts the French Grand Prix for MotoGP. This was also the track that played host to the 1967 French Grand Prix Formula 1 race, which was won by Sir Jack Brabham. But the thing is, back then, the drivers hated it, and so did the spectators. It's hardly glowing stuff, and a little foreboding. So what makes today different, you may be asking? Well, truthfully, not a hell of a lot. The track isn't much different from what it was back then, and it is still relatively short. Some parts may need to be altered to the circuit to make it work, but then you have to ask yourself, why not go to somewhere like Dijon? At least that place has some gorgeous flow to it, and you can work whatever changes you need into it. But then you would have to consider the costs that will go into it. Are you starting to see this French track problem that I mentioned at the start of this whole thing? But what if we deviated from the permanent circuits and onto the street ones? In theory. I know we're all starting to grow tired of these street tracks, but let's just see what options we have here. And let's go to the obvious one and perhaps the unrealistic one, a street race in Paris. And as anyone who's ever played Gran Turismo can attest to, their street circuits can be mighty spectacular and beautiful and house for racing. The idea of holding a street race in Paris does stand a stretch too far. Are they really going to ground the city to a halt for a week to host a Formula 1 Grand Prix? The answer to that is they do host the Paris E-Prix for Formula E. It's based almost in the centre of Paris and not too far away from the Eiffel Tower and other tourist hotspots, thereby allowing you to get robbed long before you reach the concession stands. But the idea of the city dumping millions into a Formula 1 race, which would entail quite a bit of a disruption, probably not going to happen. One city that is considering it though is Nice. Stefano Domenicali, the CEO of Formula 1, has touted this city could be a future Formula 1 venue for the French Grand Prix. Now, the locals didn't want a bar of this, which is hardly surprising, but it is important to note that the mayor of Nice is Christian ESTROSI, and he has a vested interest in the sport, so it does make sense that he would like to see a race held in quote-unquote his town. That is, provided the locals don't kick up a stink about it, or that he was instead hell-bent on having the race held at Paul Ricard instead, and said the idea of a Nice Grand Prix is off the table. So, where does this leave the French Grand Prix in actuality? Well, they're cooked. And not in a good way. It is looking more unlikely by the day that there will be a French Grand Prix in the near future. So looking back on all of what we covered, we have to ask the ultimate question that was posed at the start of this video and perhaps would be good to try and answer here. How can we save the French Grand Prix? Well, it would require a large amount of backing, a facility that is up to spec and one that they would want to race at, and a great potential return for investors that are willing to fork out the dough in the first place to make this thing run. Now, Paul Ricard, the venue that once was, had a big problem pertaining to the road infrastructure. F1 also want to increase circuit capacity to allow for more spectators to attend the circuit and for more VIP guests to rock up to the circuit to make the sport look more important than it actually is. Now, they may have left Paul Ricard, but if you appease these people well enough, you could very well convince them to host a race in your own backyard. This particular backyard is, of course, France, the birthplace of Grand Prix. This does hold significant historic value not just for Formula 1, but motor racing, and losing the French Grand Prix, again, would be a crying shame, as it would be to lose the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps. I mean, we can't lose both. What if we didn't have to? Hear me out. Rotation. Not an alien concept to Formula 1. It's been done in the past, albeit with tracks in the British Grand Prix rather than whole-ass Grand Prix. But look, we keep both Grand Prix, we don't totally ditch the history of Formula 1, Spa-Francorchamps still keeps some love even if its races are mid, and it's a guaranteed lock for at least a decade, until such time that an alternative solution is found. So come on, Formula 1. Instead of hosting multiple races in countries where there are less human rights than there are toilets on an interstate coach, preserve at least some of the history of the sport. And do it knowing that while Alfa Romeo may not be a winning team anymore, that the Indy 500 isn't a part of the F1 calendar anymore, that Switzerland has banned motorsport and view the car as a mechanical reincarnation of a Demogorgon, France still has a strong foothold in motorsport. I mean, after all, we have Alpine, we have Esteban Ocon, and we have Pierre Gasly, as well as potentially Teo Porcher and Isaac Hadjar in the future. So come on guys, I've listed some options on a silver platter, and I'm sure that there's some money in all of this somewhere. You're Formula One, you can make it happen, so do it. S'il vous plaît?
I know you told your friend you're not okay, and tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt that way. And guess you're trying to stay strong and fake a smile until I look away. But I've known you too long, it hurts to watch your blue eyes fade to gray as you fade away.